Hi again, I'm back for another video. I know at the end of the last video I said I was actually going to skip the other newbie dungeons, but it occurred to me since I'm doing this video for new players, it'd probably be beneficial for me to show you how those dungeons play out. So I'm doing this as an optional video for my main Let's Play set, and we're going to go over each dungeon. I'm going to discuss what the purpose of the dungeon is and the strategy for the last boss of each dungeon. So, as we've done so far, we did both the Dwarf Starting Zone dungeons, and we did the dungeon Trollmire. So now the next dungeon we're going to do is going to be the Ruins of Corpool. This is probably the hardest of all the newbie dungeons, so it's the most important to understand the strategies for this dungeon over pretty much any other, especially if you're playing a human character, since if you want to complete the quest for your human character, you pretty much have to clear the Ruins of Corpool. Now, you might notice at the beginning of this, we get a message that the zone is so easy and we stroll to the last area. The reason why is because we've completed 3 dungeons already. It'll let you skip to the last area of a given newbie dungeon so you can go straight to the boss, which is really useful, since it's recommended that you clear these unless you find some really good gear on the way. The Ruins of Corpool is a sort of tower dungeon that's full of undead and rogue-type enemies. And we have a rare rat over here, but I don't know what class he is, so let's see what we got. Looks like a Warmick enemy, so he's not terribly threatening. Now, none of these enemies are going to provide a particularly big challenge to our character since he's so well geared, but Corpool is a very dangerous dungeon. There's a lot of enemies in here that aren't very threatening. There's a lot of molds and rats that will appear, but skeleton enemies can be very tough. Like this one up here is a skeleton warrior, and they start with really high physical power and accuracy and have dual-wield attacks. When you first come into Corpool, you can run into enemies who are 3 or 4 levels higher than you, and some of these skeleton warriors can kill a character in 2 turns. It's generally recommended that you kind of deal with them at range, never engage them without a regeneration infusion or a shield rune on, and try and kill them as quickly as possible. They also have a stun attack, and if you're stunned, you do 80% reduced damage for the duration of the stun, so you also have a set of abilities will go on cooldown, so you want to avoid that happening at all possible. Now, this room we just entered is a... Wow, I just took a whole lot of damage. That was the boss. The room that we just entered is a pre-made room. This room will always appear on every version of the 3rd Corpool map. It's the boss room. And hidden back here around the corner, he spawns right around here, is the boss of Corpool. He's the Shade. He's a mage character, and he's undead. He's immune to some CC abilities, though I don't remember which offhand. And he has a really nasty freeze effect, which can lock you in place. He's easily the hardest of the newbie zone bosses, or at least tied with Brotok the Reaver, so it's recommended that you come in here at least with some means to deal with stun or a lot of health. And he dropped a nice light for us. I don't know if we're going to use it right now. You know, actually we will. We will use that right now. Now, Corpool, or the Shade of Corpool, much like other newbie zone bosses, has some fixed drops that he has a higher chance to drop. He can sometimes drop this staff right here, but because we found it early in the game, he wasn't going to drop it this time around. And most of the bosses, even though they will have fixed items on their drop table, don't always drop those items. It's just a higher % chance. But if it's something you're looking for, it's good to know that you can go to the end boss of a dungeon and have a higher chance to get it. I want to look around in here some more because there's a dungeon feature I'd like to find. Additionally, escorts can have a chance to appear in Ruins of Corpool for dwarf and human characters. So we're going to go up the stairs and we're going to see if we can run into any escort quests and see if we can find a vault. Now, I have some additional options here that I didn't have in the last escort I did. The second option down is to offer to help, but actually betray this character because they're an arcane caster. As I discussed it in my first video, arcane casters are kind of discriminated against in this game. they're not really well liked by the population, and most people know not to trust them. If your character in a previous game has discovered the town of Ziggur, and read the sign at the entrance, you can betray casters in future games to the Ziggur for different abilities and rewards. So we're going to do this because I don't really need anything that the Seer is going to provide me, and we're going to go to the goal area. There's a Banshee here, and they are way out of depth. The level 25 enemy should never spawn in this dungeon. It's a very small chance, and as you can see, they don't appear to be there. That's because they're invisible. So they're hard to hit. I think we already have that item equipped, but thankfully we have this item that gives us the bonus to blind fight. So we'll be able to defeat this enemy without too much trouble because we're not taking a major accuracy penalty. A nice thing about escorts is they won't go through doors, and because of this, if you go onto a map where there's a lot of doors in the way, the escort won't actually spawn until you've exited the level and returned to it. This can be really handy because some dungeons, it's really hard to keep the escort alive, and if you can come back when the dungeon is empty to do the escort, you don't have any risk of the escort dying and losing their ability. Okay, my choices for this are willpower and cunning, which I don't get anything out of. Mental saving throws, an ability that lets me see in a radius of 7, and Nature's Touch, which is a low health heal. It's not going to scale well for me, but I'm going to take it anyway, just for extra health. And this is what I was actually hoping to see right here. This is a Corpool vault. These can also appear in a couple of other dungeons. Tempest Keep, High Peak, and Fowler End Camp can also have vaults that are exactly like this. It's composed of multiple rooms that'll have much higher level enemies, but has a chance to have really good loot. So we're going to open it and see what we have. The first room, we have a level 20 Grey Mold. It's not threatening to anybody, and we're just going to kill it off, and he's guarding an artifact, which is a very nice one-handed weapon, which we'll replace our current equipped weapon with, because it has much higher damage and a nice effect which will confuse enemies when we hit them, as well as very high critical strike chance. This must have been where the Banshee was. Normally there will always be an enemy in this room, but because the enemy isn't there, that tells me that for however reason, it managed to get out of the vault, which means the Banshee probably teleported out. These enemies are normally supposed to be asleep when you enter the floor, but sometimes they kind of bug out, or they react differently than they're supposed to, so they can end up where they're not supposed to be. If we'd come in here at regular level, that Banshee probably would have killed us. Okay, we have an Orc Necromancer here. Orcs can sometimes have abilities of players. They can be a very threatening enemy, and you usually don't run into them until very, very late in the game, but sometimes they can appear in these lower-level dungeons. An Orc Necromancer will have all the abilities of a player Necromancer. They can summon undead, they can shoot you with bolts of dark energy, and they have a lot of health. Like any caster, we're going to want to keep them stunned and locked down as much as possible so we can kill them quickly. Because we were able to stun them right off the bat, they didn't get a chance to do anything interesting and died very quickly. This is a skeleton mage. They are pretty much exactly how it sounds. They are skeletons, they cast spells. They can also be incredibly threatening enemies to run in early on, because they could do about 150 damage in 2 rounds of combat. When you see one, you kind of want to make a beeline to them and kill it as quickly as possible, or alternatively, you want to lead them around a corner. Because of how field of vision works, you can't often avoid a combat, or avoid a attack just by standing one square to the left or right of a door. If you're trying to lure a caster down, like say the caster was right here, you could stand 2 spaces over, and eventually they would reach the doorway, but they couldn't hit you from there very easily. So they'll step out one further step, and you'll be able to get them into melee range without putting yourself in too much risk. This is recommended whenever you find yourself in a long corridor with a caster, or near an open room with a caster, and need to lure them somewhere where you can kill them without getting pelted down yourself. We found a lot of loot in here, mostly because of that vault. We're not really going to use any of it, though, because I think we have better in almost every slot. Okay, here's another vault. This is the other kind of vault which will commonly appear in Corpool. It's an elven, not an elven mage, it's a skeleton mage vault. This can also appear in a few other dungeons. When you open it up, there's 4 skeleton mages inside. They're about the same level as me, so they don't see the major level increase that you usually see with vaults. But because it's 4 skeleton mages, as you can see, they just did a lot of damage, a lot more than anything else in this dungeon. So what we're going to do is, as I said earlier, we're just going to lure them down the corridor. And you can see they hit me despite me not being able to see them. That's because they still have line of sight on me from where they're standing. So if I step one step over to the side, I can just wait for a couple of turns until they come around the corner. And then I can just kill them one at a time without taking a major risk. Found a floor artifact here. Artifacts can spawn on the floor like they can in most other roguelike games, and it's a little more common than, say, NetHack, but it's not super common. You might find one every 3 or 4 dungeons. In this case, we got a pair of gloves called Flame Rot. They're not going to be very useful to us. They can be pretty useful for willpower-based casters like Cursed, Doomed, and Mind Slayers, Solipsists, because it gives you a willpower bonus, which is pretty nice. Okay, we have a cursed rare snake. At lower levels, this might be a little dangerous. It doesn't look like he has rampage, though, so his damage output probably isn't going to be very impressive. Now let's just check to make sure we didn't have an escort spawn on this floor. Alright. And this is something interesting on the map right here, an adventurer's party. They start to appear around level 10. They can be very, very threatening because what it is it's 3 player enemies, 2 to 3 player enemies will spawn on a map, and they will have all the abilities of a normal player character. And they can be very dangerous. We're going to engage them, and I might die in this combat because I'm not generally good at handling adventurers at lower levels. But I just want to show you how this works, because you will run into these and probably lose a fair bit of characters. Okay, we have it looks like they're a Corruptor, because they're using 2 axes. That tells me they're dual-wielding one-handed weapons. Normally you can only use daggers in the offhand, so only Corruptors can do that. He'll have diseases and something called Bone Shield, which will absorb all the damage that I do to him until his Bone Shield is gone. So let's try and get him out of the way. No, he can hit me here. That's not good. Alright, let's see if we can kill him before he kills us. Excellent. Now there'll be at least one more adventurer on this map, and we don't want to just walk into an ambush or we could die really quickly, so let's see. That's strange. Where? Oh. Okay, this one is a Mind Slayer. Mind Slayer is a type of psychic enemy. They basically triple wield. They can up to triple wield. They'll usually dual wield 2-handed weapons, and they have damage shields. This particular one probably isn't going to be terribly threatening. Most of the NPC Mind Slayers aren't very hard to kill. Yeah, as you can see, we just killed him in one hit. He dropped a very nice ring for us. Gladiator's Copper Ring. I will equip that in place of, let's see, my Frost Resistance Ring. I don't really need that right now. Now, an advantage to killing adventuring parties is they tend to have items that are much higher quality than you'd normally find on the dungeon floor. And you can also get Alchemist quest rewards, which will let you complete the Alchemist potions well before you normally would be able to. But they're very dangerous. The next dungeon we're going to go into is one of the shallower elf starter dungeons, the Fowler End camp. And this is the second dungeon that most shallower elf characters will do, and it's also a very hard dungeon because there's a lot of caster enemies here that are very hard to deal with. The sound of lightning tells me that there's a caster off in the distance, probably fighting with one of the random enemies who will spawn. The Fowler End will fight other enemies that appear in this dungeon, like animals and skeletons and things like that, so sometimes you can come on them when they're distracted and get an easy kill in. We have an Elven Mage back here. I think they use fire spells. They're not as threatening as the Lightning Mages are, but they can still pick you off pretty quickly at a distance. These are the Tempests. They do mostly lightning damage. If you can get some early lightning resistant items, this is a really easy dungeon. Otherwise, it can be a little bit difficult. And as you can see, we just lured them the same way I said to do in Corpool, just around a different type of corner. We just waited one space down the corner until they came to us. Once you make an enemy aggressive on you, they don't just wait for you to come back out into vision. They will come to you almost every time. So that's what you want to do when you need to get something close to you. We have another rare enemy here. He's invisible right now. It looks like he is a Shadow Blade, which means he's going to do extra damage on attacks. He might be able to blink around a bit. And he's cast something at me, Congeal Time, which is probably a slow ability. Now this is the boss chamber for Fowler End camp. It's 6 rooms. The room south of this one will have the boss in it, and the adjacent rooms will have spellcasters and melee attackers. In these rooms you want to kill the spellcasters first because they do the most damage. The melee in here really aren't hard to deal with, even at low levels. The boss is a Corruptor enemy. I believe they have disease, they do blight damage, and they can also cast fire spells, so we want to kill them pretty quick, like any caster. Alright, we've cleared this floor. I'm not going to clear the other 2 floors. I don't really see a reason to at this point, because there isn't a whole lot of vaults here, and I've already shown you what I wanted to in the vaults. As long as you don't enter a floor, they never generate the items for that floor, so it doesn't matter if you skip newbie dungeon areas, because the only thing you're really going to miss out on is experience most of the time. But if there ends up being some low-level artifact you really, really find you need, you can always go back to these dungeons later on and see if you luck out with getting it there. Out of the items I found here, I found an item called a Dark Rod. I think I'll keep that just in case I find something later on that might make it useful. It's never been useful to me. Some players swear by it. It's an item that will put an enemy's infusions on cooldown, which in certain fights can be pretty useful, but I found its value has been diminished greatly in recent patches. And the only other item I'm going to keep from this is this Copper Amulet of the Fish, which will give me water breathing later on, and that's pretty useful. The next dungeon is the Scintillating Caves, which is pretty easy for shallower characters when they start out, because they start with a shield rune instead of a regeneration rune, but it should be one of the last dungeons you do as any other type of character, because there's a lot of casters here. We have a rare right off the floor. He has stealth, which tells me he's probably a rogue. We'll want to kill him before he can get any poisons on us or anything. The crystal enemies in here are all spellcasters, and they correspond to different elements. If you're playing a caster character and you're really reliant on certain types of elemental damage, this might be something you want to skip until you have an alternative, or you may need to run from some enemies in here because you won't be able to damage them at all. The boss here is the Spellblaze Crystal. He's immune to CC, and he's also immune to a lot of disease and poison effects. So if you're reliant on those, try not to waste too much stamina or resources on those things, because it's not really going to be much help. Oh, I guess he's not immune to stun. I was mistaken. That's a good thing. And he dropped us a very nice ring. This gives max stamina, constitution, willpower, 2 really good resistances, and extra air capacity. So we're going to use this over the ring that we found earlier in the first or the second video that gave armor. The other item we found is the Unerring Scalpel, which is a nice dagger for low-level rogues. Normally, the Spellblaze Crystal will drop a Crystal Focus. Or at least he has a higher chance to drop it, but it doesn't look like we found that on this character, and I don't think we will. The Crystal Focus is an item that you use to imbue an item into an artifact much later in the game. You can do it with a low-level item, but it's generally recommended to wait till the end game to actually use the crystal. And I'll explain that if we do find it. And this is the downside of the transmogrification chest. The last item on the list would have been a really big upgrade over the healing rune I have equipped, so I wish I'd picked that up, but oh well. The last 2 starting zones are the starting zones for Fowler and elf characters. The passageway into Norgos's lair, and the Heart of the Gloom. We're going to do Norgos's lair first. Norgos's lair is largely considered the easiest of all the starting areas. The enemies are almost all animals and vermin, with the most powerful enemies usually being snakes or the occasional bandit. The last boss of the area is Norgos the Guardian. He's a bear enemy, he has a lot of health, and does high physical damage. He also has a stun attack. He's a little bit harder than Prox, but generally speaking, he's not too difficult to take down, and he's very susceptible to stuns. He dropped an amulet for us, the Feathersteel Amulet, which is a very nice item. It makes it so fatigue is reduced. Fatigue is the penalty you take to spell and ability costs when you have armor equipped. It also increases your maximum encumbrance and your movement speed by 20%. This is a really useful item for certain character types, and it's a very, very useful item to ghoul characters who really need that movement speed bonus to overcome one of their greatest weaknesses as a race. It also has the ability to avoid pressure traps, but there's not many of those left in the game anymore, so that's just kind of a gravy ability that's tacked on to the end. I really like this amulet. I think I'm going to use it for now over the Withering Orbs, just because I like my abilities that use stamina to not cost anything extra, at least. The additional movement speed's very nice too, especially when you need to close on a caster. It basically makes it so that every 5th step you take is free, so... it's definitely a good amulet to keep around, and you'll often find it. It's very rare that I make a new character and don't get it from one of the starting dungeons. The second dungeon for Fowler End starting characters is the Heart of the Gloom, which is a sort of fungal cave that's been populated almost entirely by animals, including bears and wolves, and carnivorous plant creatures. Everything in here has ranged attacks and pinning attacks, and it can be a really, really irritating dungeon to get through. This rare is a Doomed, which is a type of cursed caster. They have a lot of knockback attacks, curses, and damage over time effects. They can be pretty dangerous later on, but because he's a rat, he doesn't have very high stats, so it's not something we need to really worry about. And this is the last boss of the Heart of the Gloom. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be intimidating, because he kind of looks like a terrier, but we're gonna kill him. Might have been a wolf before. No, I think that was somebody's lapdog. And we got a vine-encircled ring for that. We already have really nice rings, but this one might be even nicer than what we've got. 4 strength, 4 will, ups nature resistance, increases physical damage, life regen, and healing mod. I'm going to hold on to it, but it's not really going to be super much of an improvement over the Gladiator's ring that I have, so we'll just put that on the back burner for now. An important thing to note about the Heart of the Gloom is that each level kind of spiders out from a center point, and the central room is always the most dangerous part of the dungeon. Oftentimes, because the central room is so large, the staircase will appear in this room, and if that happens, you want to back out of the room as quickly as possible and get to one of these side branches so you don't get overwhelmed. Because everything here has a ranged attack. If you're in a room full of enemies, everything will be able to attack you at the same time, and you'll take a lot of damage very quickly, which can make this dungeon a little more dangerous. It's not too difficult, though, if you can take advantage of these narrow corridors. Now that we're level 14, we're at the cap for the 2 elf towns for the level of gear that they will start showing up with. Generally, you want to avoid going into shops until you're close or near, or until you're at close or slightly above the cap of items that will appear in those shops. That way you can get the highest level possible items from a shop. The shops only reroll 2 or 3 times through the entire course of the game, so you want to make it a point to get to these places when there's actually worthwhile items or a chance to be worthwhile items within. This first town we entered is the Fowler End starter town, Chateau, and it has 3 weapon shops, a regeneration, or excuse me, not regeneration, infusion shop, heavy plate shop, and a light armor shop. And we'll just go through these and see if there's anything worth buying or anything better than what we've already got. When you're looking at a new item, you can hold down the control button and compare it, and it will show you what stats you lose over what stats you gain. It could probably do to be a little bit more robust, but Yeah, as you can see, this is way worse than our current helm. Nothing we're really going to get from there either. So let's check the infusion shop. This is what I'm more interested in. Here we go. Here's a very nice regeneration infusion. We're going to buy that. We're going to replace the healing infusion we bought earlier. This store contains totems and torques, which are items that go in your tool slot, and they'll have different abilities that you can use. And these are Mind Stars, which are caster weapons, intended for willpower-paced casters. Across the bridge over here, there'll be 3 more shops. There'll be a bow shop for ranged characters, a mace shop for melee characters, and then there's a sword shop also for melee characters. The other low-level town we haven't gone to yet is Valle, which is the shallower elf starting town. Valle is more intended for caster characters. Most of the shops are built around caster and roguelike characters. There's also an alchemist quest here like we found in the first town. And the rewards for this are a magic and willpower boost, a saving throw boost, or 4 additional stat points. Our saving throws are going to be really high as a dwarf, and we're not getting anything out of magic, so we're going to take the Elixir of Mastery, which was the 4 stat points. This shop deals in runes. Runes are generally intended for characters who are casters or who are comfortable with going not going anti-magic or taking the anti-magic benefits. In the past, most characters would utilize runes. I would argue in the most recent version, with the introduction of Betrayal of Escorts, it doesn't really suit you to get these on a character who isn't going to make use of arcane abilities unless you really, really want a rune. Because if you take a rune, you won't be able to betray escorts anymore because you'll count as an arcane character. There's also a cloak shop, a shop that deals in staves, a light armor shop. Now this is an interesting item. Items of unlife make you effectively an undead, so you don't have to breathe at all. And this is handy later in the game where you can equip it during the case of like a cave-in, and you won't have to worry about suffocating to death, which I find is quite beneficial at certain points in the game. And then down here we have not a dagger shop, it's a sword shop. I thought it was a dagger shop. At this point in the game, when you're around level 14 or so, I would also recommend, if you're a dwarf character, going back to the dwarf starting area and going into the shops there now. Since we're in this area, there's also a random event I want to do. We'll kill these adventurers so we don't stumble into them later. And we have a Corruptor enemy here and a Solipsist enemy. Solipsists are caster enemies. They're Psionicysts. They summon Thought-Forged characters who are their DPS summons. They do a lot of damage. Generally with Solipsists, you want to kill them as quickly as humanly possible, and you want to use other enemies as buffers to make sure they aren't able to pick you off at range. They're probably the most damaging enemies in the game, and they will likely be nerfed in the next patch. They were also reduced in their power during the current patch, but it seems like not enough sometimes. Now we want to position ourselves so we're not in line of sight, at least clean line of sight of the Solipsist, And we are in clean line of sight of the Corruptor, but because our saves are so high, he's not having much luck with debuffing us or hitting us with any poisons or anything. Okay, now we've got the solipsist out of the open. We're going to rush it and try and kill it in one round. Alright, not quite, but they are stunned, which means we should be able to take them out without any further problems. Okay, we're going to use our blinding infusion. And we managed to kill it off. Now, when you kill a solipsist, any Thought-Forged characters that they have up will die pretty much immediately afterwards. The last interesting thing that you want to do before you start the Tier 2 dungeons is this event right here. And you may have to move around in this area for a while to get it to trigger. A half-dead lumberjack approaches. Before you stands a man covered in dirt and blood. He's out of breath and half-mad. Please, you must help. It is slaughtering everybody in my village. Please. He points his finger at the nearby forest. Now you can tell him to screw off. You're not going to really want to. It's kind of a dick move, and this is one of the early character unlocks. I recommend doing it because it unlocks a very fun class. Now we get a message here, a lumberjack falls to the ground dead. There is a limited number of lumberjacks. I've never seen him kill all of the lumberjacks before. And here's our enemy. He's a boss-type enemy, Ben Cruthar the Cursed. He's always level 10. You can usually kill him at about level 6 or 7. I don't recommend taking him on before that because he has some nasty CC abilities and can do quite a bit of damage. And he drops some items, and you usually get a pickaxe for your trouble. Now we'll go into Iron Council, and we'll just take a look around here and see what there is in the shops, and I'll just go over what's here. You'll find that whenever you come back into Iron Council, you will always spawn on the upstairs for Escape from Reknor. I don't know why that happens. I'm assuming it's just something hard-coded into the system. So we have a sword shop here, and there's a whole lot of epic items in here, the little purple ones, but we're not going to use any of them because our current weapon's quite a bit better. There's a mace shop and an axe shop. There's a light armor store, a heavy armor store. There's a cloak shop. And you'll find cloak shops will also often have robes and occasionally belts. Lastly, there's a rune shop here for caster characters or characters who feel inclined to use runes, and a gem shop. Gem shops will almost never have anything worth buying for anyone in them, but sometimes you'll get a crystal focus up here in the shop, and you'll want to buy it if you see it, at least as long as you're playing an arcane character or a character who you aren't going to go anti-magic on, and I'll touch on anti-magic here in a little bit. So we've finished with all the starting dungeons, and we've explored all the starting towns, which means that we're about ready to go into the Tier 2 dungeons, and that's what we're going to get to in the next video. Thanks.